everyone wants to discuss what the left has got wrong, where do we need to go next? And Roger Hallam, who is the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, he gets up and he says, well, what's gone wrong is that everyone in this room is a fucking cunt. Then you had all these people who were saying, you've brought violence into the space, I've been harmed, everyone's been harmed, this is white anger. How is it that a room full of adults can be derailed in such a way and can feel comfortable making their distress the object of everyone's attention? I just don't think Angela Davis did this. I don't think that Huey Newton did this. I don't think that George Jackson, like, you know, when he's in Soledad prison, was like, how have I been harmed? I'm not saying that all of these ideas are bad or that they're always bad, but I think that good ideas have become blown out of proportion and applied to everything. And at no point has anyone gone, get a grip. You've got Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer betting the house on growth. And most people are saying, well, even if you do deliver it, how's it going to benefit me? And again, you can either look at them and go, well, you're stupid because line go up. Or you could say, well, actually, we've had years of growth under the Conservatives, which didn't benefit you. We've got this parasitic landlord model of an economy where the only way to make money is to own stuff and just skim profit off the top. And if you have to work for your living, you're locked out of that.
Hi Ash, welcome to Politics Joe. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm shaking off a cold, so I'm so sorry to your audience that I'm bunged up.
Absolutely fine. It's a pleasure to have you here. I would take a bunged up Ash Sarkar any day of the week. For those unfamiliar somehow with your work, tell us who you are. How would you like to introduce yourself?
I would like to introduce myself as well-adjusted. So I'm a contributing editor at Novara Media. I've written a book which is coming out super soon called Minority Rule. 5'3", cute face, chubby waist, thick legs in shape.
Right, yeah, very good. This disarming to have a guest sat opposite you and speak in that fashion. I'm excited for the rest of this conversation.
You're like, okay, this is where it starts.
Yeah, where can it go? Where can it get worse? Look, the Minority Rule, I don't have the latest version here with the full cover, but this is a proof I got. It's brilliant. It's original and vivid and reflective, and it feels... there's kind of this paradox. It feels like it's written by like a really sage old philosopher sequestered away in like the corner of a university, but who is somehow across pop culture to be able to make references that you find funny and like have touchstones with. It's a marvelous piece of writing. We're going to talk about it over the course of this interview. It starts though in quite describing our current condition, our current state, and I would say it was quite bleak in its description of where we are. And before we start talking about responses and how we ended up here, I just wondered if, for the sake of people before they've read it, if you could set that scene and if you could provide that context of what you view sort of the current political and economic conditions, particularly in Britain, to be.
Sure, everybody is black-pilled. Like, if you are a renter, if you're a homeowner, if you're unemployed, if you've got a job, if you're a pensioner, if you have just started sixth form, you feel like there is something fundamentally wrong with society. And I think that that's one of the things that's so astonishing about the time that we live in, is that feeling that the social contract has been irreparably broken, that transcends left or right, it transcends urban, small town, it transcends age, it transcends gender. So that intro, I really wanted to draw from the experiences of my friends, just things that I was seeing on a daily basis. You know, I had a friend who was going through a heartbreak, which is like shit at the best of times.
Yeah.
And she was like, oh, so because I had to take my former partner off the tenancy agreement, my landlord came back and said, that's going to be an extra £300 a month, which is crazy. It's such an insane thing to happen, and yet that's a pretty good representation of what it's like to be a renter. I think that if you live in a small town like my brother-in-law does, he lives kind of near Batley, and he's walking around with his dog and his baby, and he's like, oh, there is a mattress in that river, or like, oh, this is just like an open bag of like dirty nappies that's just like out on the street all the time. You feel like something is broken, like that something about society is uncaring, not working, in a state of decline. And so I know that that's a bleak place to start, and I don't actively want to bum people out. It's very good for journalists when people are bummed out, but like, you know, it's not the mood I want to leave people with. But I thought that it was the most emotionally honest thing that I could write.
Yeah, I think that's probably why it resonated with me, to be honest with you, because I think for people of a certain age, the phrase you used in that answer was that the social contract has been like irreparably or irrevocably damaged or broken, which is obviously quite a striking thing to say, because you go, all right, well, if the social contract's broken, then why does anyone feel obliged to prop up or support the nation state, right? Right, okay, so what are we talking about? Like, are we in like a pre-revolutionary condition? And you probably go, no, actually, I don't think we are, right? So do you think anger is an appropriate response to that situation you've just described, particularly from young people? And do you see that anger?
I mean, I think that anger is something which extends so much further than young people. Like, something which I think drives the polling support that we see for reform. I mean, I think, 2 or 3 polls in a row now, they've been coming above Labour. That's because people are angry. And something which my mum says, which I think is super wise, is that anger is sometimes the only thing that's standing between you and profound humiliation. And it's a feeling which kicks in and says, no, you're worth better than this situation. And I think that that's part of what people are feeling, because either you look at the state of the world and you go, well, this is a reflection of me, how hard I do or don't work, or my ability to connect with people, or you tap into anger and you go, like, this shouldn't be the way that it is. So I think that anger is, when tempered by other emotions like empathy, a desire to connect with other people, it's healthy. I think that at the moment, anger is kind of all that people have. That there isn't this countervailing tendency of connection.
That's interesting. And also you can make the argument, and people have very eloquently made the argument, that it's almost like a defining characteristic of our late capitalist system, right? That it grinds you down to the point that you aren't able to either imagine an alternate, better reality, you don't have the creativity to, or indeed have the emotional depth and reserve to feel, because it has ground you down to such an extent that you go, I just can't be asked with the emotional labour of thinking about how this world could be better.
And I think that a lot of people are Marxists, even if they don't know it. I actually think a lot of right-wing people are Marxists, even if they don't know it. They wouldn't describe themselves as Marxists, and they certainly don't believe in communism, but I think that they understand that our economic conditions have a profound impact on how we think, how we feel. And so if you start from that premise, which you go, okay, conditions shape consciousness. Well, let's look at our conditions. I spend so much time by myself doing things I don't enjoy, like being on social media. And I'll be on Instagram and I'll be like, oh, here comes the body dysmorphia. I can't stop scrolling. Or on Twitter, I'll be like, why am I just reading racial abuse all the time? This can't be good for me. And yet these apps have bypassed my awareness as a user, and I'm still doing it. Yeah. And, if you think about the impact of all of these things, and this is a point which I make in the book, is that it makes us suspicious, lonely, hostile towards other people, constantly trying to fend off feelings of low self-esteem. And that is really conducive to right-wing projects which are based on hostility towards others. And I think that's why we're not in this sort of hopeful pre-revolutionary moment, because these conditions are making us atomized and kind of mutually antagonistic.
Yeah. I guess it also has quite a disassociative effect, where particularly in a sort of information environment where you can see or are exposed to the horrors of the world in your social media feed, and then you go to mainstream media, or, well, any media, to be honest with you, and it doesn't show you that same thing, and you're sort of thinking, just hang on a second, I could have sworn that I saw X atrocity take place, or I stumbled upon some horrific video from Bakhmut or whatever it is, and you're going, how, if I have seen this thing, why am I not being told about it? Or why is Keir Starmer talking about Ukraine in this way, that we're going to sort of send them aid for 100 years, and not talking about this horrific video that I've seen? And as a result of which, you feel increasingly more isolated and also kind of disconnected and disassociated. Like, if we're not dealing with the same set of facts, how can we have a political discussion and come to a mutual place of understanding?
I mean, I think it's this feeling of we don't live in a shared reality anymore. And I sort of wonder to what extent we ever have. Because I'm just thinking about that run up to the invasion of Iraq, when you had, most of the newspapers, almost all of broadcast media taking a very pro-war line. It didn't adequately reflect the case against that war. And lots of people were going, but this seems really obvious to me that this is going to go really badly. Or if you look at the period following the global financial crisis, when something which had been caused by the banks being, reckless and greedy has suddenly become a crisis of sovereign debt. And you've got all the major journalists backing up the politicians and saying there is no alternative. So I think that where we are is maybe the result of, a cumulative denial of reality by those who have been, I guess, appointed or set up as the custodians of quality information. And then you get fake news, moral panics. I'm not saying that fake news and misinformation isn't a problem. It is. But it's a bit rich for somebody who was convinced that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction to be like, guys, we should be really wary about fake news. It's like, bitch, that's you.
So so there's other stuff there, isn't there, about the journeys they go on from sort of spin doctor before an illegal war, and then doing BetterHelp ad reads and stuff like that.
You can say his name. He's not going to pop up in the mirror behind you. I mean,
I'll say it. Well, I won't say it 3 times because then Alistair Campbell will pop up in the mirror behind me. It's extraordinary, the space, the sort of the distance that you can travel as a national politics in that period of time.
I mean, there's a chapter in here which is about lobby journalism in particular, and my husband describes it as me leaning out of the car with an Uzi and just being like, let it ring. Because when I think about the failures of journalism, and I say this because I believe in the power of journalism, maybe I overly romanticize it, but when I think about just how crap people's work or sense of integrity can be, nowhere is it worse than the lobby in many ways. And you can take somebody like Ross Kempsell. So he was, a political correspondent. He then quits his job in journalism, goes to work for the Conservative Party, then comes back into journalism, and then leaves again to work for the Conservative Party, and now is one of the youngest members of the House of Lords. And you can tell that story in terms of his integrity. For me, the more embarrassing thing is we kept taking him back.
Yeah.
It's the same with Allegra Stratton, right? Quits journalism, works for the Conservative Party, is a victim of Partygate, RIP to a real one. And then when her political project has failed and her professional reputation has been tarnished because of her part in it, political journalism goes, come back to us.
Yeah.
That's on us.
It is on us. You're right. Yeah. And it's a little bit embarrassing, I guess. Tolerance of that revolving door, and there's many industries that share that revolving door, right? Consultancy, communications being another one. Let's dial in to this puppy. I think what, to my mind, was the most controversial part of the book is probably where you start, and talking about being self-reflective and not, well, I wouldn't say talking about yourself, but talking about leftist politics, mistakes that have been made, and errors that have prevented people of a left-wing persuasion from effectively organising or acting politically, right? And you talk about liberal identity politics, you talk about victimhood, you talk about the attention economy, rather than trying to do a precis of it and tell you what I thought. Maybe we'll just start by you say, you make the argument, right? You tell me what you're trying to say with that first chapter.
Sure. So the reason why I start with the left rather than in any other place, and I went back and forth about whether or not I should do that, was because when I looked at the strategies of the right, weaponized grievance and victimhood, the more I realised that these had their origins on the left and with a particular kind of liberal identity politics, by which I mean individualistic, concerned with representation, not really rooted in anti-capitalism or anti-imperialism. So I was like, I either ignore this thing, which seems really important, or I risk pissing off all of my friends by writing about it. So sorry to my friends. And I opened the chapter by talking about an event that I was facilitating in Liverpool. So there's like a couple of hundred people. Everyone wants to discuss what the left has got wrong. Where do we need to go next? And Roger Hallam, who is the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, who's serving time at the moment, he gets up and he says, well, what's gone wrong is that everyone in this room is a fucking cunt, which I think is the funniest thing anyone could have said.
Yeah.
And I think it's fine if you don't like someone using that language. I think it's fine if you think, oh, this seems a bit emotionally manipulative. You're trying to shock me into doing what you want. But at the end of the day, it's an old dude who looks like Gandalf swearing. Like it's not a big deal. And then you had all these people who were saying, you've brought violence into the space. I've been harmed. Everyone's been harmed. This is white anger. Like somehow it became a racial thing. And I was like, cunt is not what the C in POC stands for. like this is not a racialized term at all. And how is it that a room full of adults can be derailed in such a way and can feel comfortable making their distress the object of everyone's attention? And I realized that it's because they've sort of been primed to look for victimhood and look for the ways in which they've been harmed and are actually kind of suspicious of working together. And there are so many other times something like this has happened. There was an organisers weekend. I didn't write about this in the book because I wasn't at this organisers weekend, but a friend was, where they were doing an icebreaker where you had to pretend to be a kitchen utensil, and someone pretended to be a salad spinner. And then some other people said, well, that's white supremacist and classist because who has a salad spinner? And then they were like, well, I came from a working class single parent family and we had a salad spinner. And then the whole thing grinds to a halt because everyone's arguing over who's been the most harmed by salad spinner gate. And it's so... I just don't think Angela Davis did this. I don't think that Huey Newton did this. I don't think that George Jackson... like, you know, when he's in Soledad prison was like, how have I been harmed by, you know, by the discourse, right? Yeah. So I then was like, okay, but then what accounts for this change? And so I look at the origins of identity politics and I look at the way in which it has become just so obsessed with the self. And I'm not saying that all of these ideas are bad or that they're always bad, but I think that good ideas have become blown out of proportion and applied to everything. So everything becomes like epistemic harm, right? Yeah. You know, symbolic harm. The salad spinner becomes epistemic harm. And at no point has anyone gone, get a grip. And I think the reason why they don't isn't because they think it's fine. I think it's because they're scared of social ostracism.
Yeah. I think you're probably right. Where do you think it comes from then? Do you see it as like a continuation of that 60s and 70s hyper-individualistic counterculture? Do you view it as maybe contributed to by social media and that kind of validation and attention economy that exists there? Is it a product of a specific political movement? Like, tell me where you see it coming from and getting here.
I mean, all of the above, plus some other stuff. So definitely social media. Social media makes us all competitors with each other for attention and competitors to define a narrative in which we are virtuous and victimized and other people are doing us wrong. So it creates those incentives. We integrate those incentives into our daily life. I think that's a part of it. Another part of it, and I say this as an arts and humanities graduate, is arts and humanities at university. Because think about what it is you're trained to do. You're trained to sit with a text or an artwork and look for the problems in it and to look for the way in which discourses are expressions of power. And again, not a bad thing. But if that's what you've been trained to do and then you're thrown into a political setting, then everything starts to look like discourse to you rather than, well, we're trying to do something. And one of the originators of identity politics, she was one of the founding members of the Combahee River Collective, a couple of years ago in an interview said, it's like they take the identity and leave the politics on the floor because they're encountering this not in a political space, but in a university one. And so I think that that's important. And that's where the finger is pointing back at me. I definitely did all this stuff as well. But it's because I'd been trained to do it. And I was such a product of my environment that I couldn't see past it.
Yeah, Jack Nicholson in The Departed. I want my environment to be a product of me. I want to be materialist in the way I conduct my politics. Let's be... Well, I guess we could be specific. Like, what is... Maybe you can draw on things that you've done in the past that you don't think you would do now, or things that you would say, or political positions that you would have. Like, what is... To be specific and sort of name it, like, what is the consequence of this adjustment or this political position for you? Because presumably it's not like, okay, right, we're all now going to start saying the N-word.
Oh,
right? Yeah. It's like...
That's actually that's the final
conclusion.
chapter.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't get to that part yet, Ash.
No, and, I also don't want to say that all of the things that come from liberal identity politics are bad. I mean, it's obviously very good that we have a lower tolerance of slurs as a society than we did maybe 15 years ago. I think that's really good.
Yeah, me too.
You're like, even though I keep getting dragged to a workplace tribunal, I think it's great. Like those things are good. But maybe, I remember coming across an idea like white privilege and going, wow, this explains so much. And of course, sometimes it does, but I don't know what white people are meant to do with that. Like, you're still going to be white at the end of the day. No one can change that. And so this way of understanding particular dynamics in society then gets turned into demands which are nonsensical. And Emma Dabiri writes about this so well. She was a big influence on that first chapter, where she says, this idea of white privilege then gets turned into a demand to white people, give up your privilege. It's like, well, what do you want me to do? I mean, Roger Hallam is in prison, which as a white man is breaking the glass ceiling, and still you don't like him because he's done some swearing. But it becomes these demands for almost like, I don't know, like a symbolic rejection of things that are not in your power to reject. I think that in the past, I probably hyper-fixated on language in a way that I would have just a lot more flexibility for now. I mean, other things which I talk about in the book where I made the wrong call for a slightly different reason. It was on Brexit, because I was surrounded by people who are like me, university educated, live in London, therefore more likely to have voted Remain. So when it came to that Brexit impasse of, 2018, 2019, my bias was to go, oh, well, Labour should be more pro-second referendum. And that's because I'd surrounded myself with people who are just like me. Whereas if I lived in another part of the country, they'd have been like, yeah, that's nuts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we do look back on that period. I certainly look back on that period of time and the way that previous truths or things that you took to be for certain, i.e. that like a popular mandate for something is essentially like gospel and you can't really challenge it, to then be like, no, actually, I think we know better. And how insane that is as a political position for a party to adopt, and to then kind of be bemused or surprised at, I mean, we'll talk about reform and I guess in more detail later, but the sort of that scale of Tory victory. So what else could it possibly have been?
Yeah.
Like, particularly when reform didn't stand against the Tories. It's like, presumably there's only one outcome here, but I mean, obviously, hindsight is 2020. I guess you spoke about white guilt, white privilege. You mentioned Robin DiAngelo and sort of some seminars that get given, which is interesting. And
the fact that Lockheed Martin were doing diversity and inclusion, unpacking white privilege, dealing with white guilt seminars. And I think there was one of the executives who was like, I realized that me telling a black woman to bring in a little attitude was problematic. And I'm like, I'm so glad. What about making weapons which tear apart black and brown civilians the world over? Is that a microaggression? Is that something else? Or Coca-Cola doing like DEI when, they're part of the reason why, poor states in Mexico have terrible rates of diabetes and people don't have access to clean water because the Coca-Cola bottling plant's taken it all. But, they're creating an inclusive workplace environment, so that's good. And this goes right to the heart of something that's happening now, which is with Trump in the Oval Office, Lots of companies are falling over themselves to get rid of DEI,
Yeah.
which I think goes to show they didn't really mean this stuff in the first place. But the ones who are sticking by it, they're not good employers either. So I think it was Costco who said, we're going to stick by our DEI policies. And Reverend Al Sharpton said, I'm going to lead a buy-in. So I'm going to take lots of black people. We're going to buy from Costco as like a reward for you sticking by DEI. Costco is in a labour dispute with the Teamsters Union. So what's this? Like, I'm sure like some of those 18,000 Teamsters are black and brown as well. So what do you do?
Well, yeah, and I guess if you think about Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement and how very closely connected it was to sort of the trade union movement, working class struggle, and those two things going hand in hand, that you can't have one without the other. That's certainly an interesting perspective. I think there was a video H Bomber guy made called "Woke Brands Don't Exist," where he talked about Keurig coffee machines. That just looms large in my head, which is your position should always be, particularly when you're talking about like a mega corporation, to be slightly suspicious if they're talking about like how right on they are about their corporate practices. And I guess my question for you is probably: have you always been as materialist in your analysis? Has it always been the case that, you know, in the case of Costco, yeah, fine, they're keeping their DEI policies, but how about we actually understand how they treat their workforce or any of their other corporate practices? Has that always been the case for your politics?
Yes, exited the womb being like, comrade, this is insufficiently materialist of you. I think what happened was, red marks felt so... it was like a light bulb got turned on. But then I read other things. I think I got quite into some of that Foucauldian, like talking about ideas and the violence of ideas. And there's important stuff in there, but then maybe got a little too into it. And then, with Corbynism, and it was this sort of moment where it felt like, again, people who are like me, downwardly mobile, socially liberal graduates. So it was like, oh, we could decide the next prime minister? Fucking hell. Where, again, maybe I forgot how to count and I forgot how to understand the balance of forces in our society. And there's nothing like getting your head kicked in at the ballot box to go, shit, I've got to go back to first principles. So I think that there was sort of like a wibbly line which led me back to materialism. And the other thing is that when I was writing this book, my partner was really helpful in just like pushing the argument further. So I'd like read him something I'd written and he would be like, okay, well, that's a social democrat could write that. And I'd be like, fuck you.
I would never.
And then I would be like, oh, right, like what's going to be, what's Marxist about this? What's rooted in materiality about this? And so while it was very annoying at the time, when he was just like, it just seems like a little bit liberal to me, I think it helped this book become what it is.
Yeah, got you. We've spoken in different ways about the same thing here. So I want to sort of turn to one of the themes you talk about in the book, which is like the other side of white privilege and white guilt, is this kind of another identity group that has emerged out of identity politics, which is this white working class. And you could possibly add man as well to the end of that, actually, right? As this kind of figure that looms large, either in media discourse or in politics, that certain political parties are very good at weaponizing. I suppose is probably the right word. So let's start. Can you talk me through that and explain to me how you set that premise up?
Well, the chapter that talks about that begins with the London riots of 2011. Which were riots which started in London, but then they went nationwide. And one of the things that was so striking about those riots was that they were catalysed by the police killing of Mark Duggan, a black man in Tottenham, but the participants weren't all black. They were working class people of all ethnicities who ended up being involved. And so then you've got to ask, well, why? Well, there's the context of austerity, the bailout of the banks, people feeling uncared for, betrayed, all the rest of it. And it was a moment where the commentariat class were trying to make sense of it, and their explanation wasn't that different from David Starkey's, who just said, well, guess white people became black overnight. That was how they made sense of the existence of a multi-ethnic working class. And obviously what he said was incredibly racist and offensive. Lots of other people were saying some version of that, just a little bit more politely. And that whole chavs moral panic, which was, early 2000s to about 2011, was about demonizing people who were white and working class for being a bit too ethnic, too flash, too loud, too into rap music, particularly for, the like Vicky Pollard kind of character. If you're a white woman, oh, well, she's having sex with black and brown men because she's got babies of all these different races. It was a time where people were so scared of a multi-ethnic working class. And then what happens? Basically, the word chav goes into decline and the phrase white working class takes its place. So you've gone from, here is this disgusting multi-ethnic working class, here is this disgusting working class white woman who has sex with men of colour, and here is this decent, left behind, abandoned, held in disdain by liberals, white working class. And when people say white working class, they're not talking about working class. They're talking about white. They're turning like an economic majority position into a kind of ethnic minority. Because what's the difference between black working class and white working class? Like, why do I never hear? I mean, if you want to look at people who are overrepresented in overcrowded housing, who are at the bottom of the labour market, Bengalis and Pakistanis. I've never once in my life heard the phrase Bengali working class. Why is that? It's because it's not doing that work as a sort of formulation to split up working class cross-identification. And as an idea, it was sort of, I was talking to my partner about this, who's from nearby Barnsley, and he said, well, I'm white and I'm working class, but I would never describe myself as both. And I was like, oh shit, there's something in that.
Yeah, there is. And I guess there's a why did, and you can actually go to the specific commentators where they talk about chavs in a certain way, and then they start lionizing this other group of people.
James Dellingpole.
Say his name. What is the political purpose? Like, why? Answer the why for me.
I think the why is that at one point it was frightening that there was a multi-ethnic working class that viewed each other as having shared interests. And then what was more useful in various ways, because it split up a working class coalition, and it also pinned the blame on the left for having left these people behind. That's why white working class becomes useful to them. I mean, these are people who, when they were writing about people who were white and working class, called them dismal ineducables, lard-gutted slappers. And then when someone like Hetty Douglas comes along, and, she was an artist who, fired off an Instagram post, which I thought was offensive and stupid. But at the end of the day, she's just some random person. Well, then, look at this snobby woman. She's everything that's wrong with the liberal left, overeducated, looks down her nose at working class people. How is what she's done in any way an equivalent with writing that kind of anti-working class invective for years in newspapers? It's because she's a useful... She's a useful stand-in for a political opponent.
Yeah. And I guess as well, essentially, if you can divide and conquer and direct political anger or energy horizontally or indeed downward rather than upward, you essentially denude a ginormous grouping from effective political organisation.
I mean, hugely. And, I'm not going to sit here and say that the trade union movement's always been perfect or it hasn't had its own, huge contradictions and tensions. But when it was mobilised and, militant and active from across the working class, it got concessions. Now we have a far less homogenous labour market than we used to because of, immigration, rising ethnic diversity. So it really, you need people to view ethnic others, with a capital O, as your enemy. That's a way of stopping that movement from coming back together.
Yeah. You talk about the minority game and playing it, and we've kind of, the other part of this conversation that we were sort of having earlier was about reform. Do you believe Nigel Farage to be the sort of ultimate player of the minority game? Like, yeah, talk to me.
I mean, that's an interesting one. Ultimate player, he certainly, and others who are influential within reform, they know how to weaponize grievance, and they know how to embody a kind of, I guess, aggrieved, resentful anger, and to make it do work for them politically. So I think they're very good at doing that. I am interested to see the extent to which great replacement stuff is going to become a more prominent part of reform's agenda. Because I think that will tell me whether or not, Nigel Farage, who I think would probably generally describe himself as more of a civic nationalist, whether that's going to be displaced by a kind of ethnic nationalism. There are certainly people on the right who are very invested in that way of thinking. I think Douglas Murray, I think Matt Goodwin. This idea of ethnicity is quite central to their idea of nationalism. With Nigel Farage, I'm not quite sure about that. To be honest, when I think about the minority game and this sort of quite cynical weaponization of identity and defining oppression in ways which benefit you politically, I think about the way in which pro-Israel advocates have, I think, either invented invented stories of victimization or inflated, distorted, amplified. And it's really hard to say when something's a confection and when it's not. But to give you an example that I talk about in the book, at the Francis Crick Institute, which is around the corner from here, it's this hugely prestigious science institute. A group of people wanted to do a fundraiser for medical aid for Palestinians. And so they ran a bake sale. And then you had people putting complaints into HR, calling it an allegedly peaceful bake sale and saying that it made them feel threatened. Now, that's crazy. Because either you're telling the truth and you genuinely looked at a slice of lemon drizzle cake, which, wanted to raise money for Palestinian kids, and you went, well, that's an attack on me. That's nuts if you think that. Or you're going, I can weaponize my own victimhood to achieve a political aim. Now, either way, I think it's bad. And I think the only way you deal with it is by saying, well, even if it is true that you feel that way, not reasonable and shouldn't be allowed to dictate the political freedoms and expression of others.
Yeah, good point. Talking about that anger, and earlier on, you mentioned about political operators like funneling anger or funneling discontent to their cause, and we are talking about Farage, but it doesn't, to me, necessarily scan that emotion has to be channeled to the radical right immediately. Like, there are other outlets for it. Why do you think that the centre-left, the left, hasn't found a way of channeling that emotion or being a vessel for it?
So I think it's to do with some of the things that I've spoken about already. So that tendency for the centre-left to be dominated by graduates who live in cities. So if you're not able to speak to the experience of people outside of that demographic, it's going to be difficult for you to channel their anger. You don't live their lives. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think that there is also a proximity to liberalism. So, whether that's leftists having a bit of an inner conundrum about whether or not to defend DEI or, the splits around Brexit. I think for the left, there is always this problem of going, well, do we align with liberals because they're, at least they're not the far right? Do we do that even though we know that the liberal centre is collapsing? So I think that's another reason why they've not been able to channel the anger. The last thing that I would say is that I thought this when during the most recent general election in 2024, Nigel Farage launched his campaign in Clacton. And people were drawn to him because he had a kind of star power. He's very good at embodying people's anger. He shows it in his face and in his body and in his delivery as well as what he's saying. And then you had these, more progressive campaigners from the Greens who were talking about austerity and all these things that I agreed with. And I was like, oh, you just seem like vegetarians. This guy's a shark. And, you're tempeh. Like there was just something about the vibe which was off. And I think that, you could root that in class. It's like a sort of middle class, professionalized way of holding yourself and talking. But it's like when people are really angry, they need you to feel the anger with them. You can't just come in and say, well, I've got the solutions for that. You've got to really be there with them. And that's what Reform are so good at.
Yeah, I totally agree with that analysis. And particularly, I think it's almost like old politics, new politics, right? Where Biden is sat there going, well, how on earth can people not see that we have like growth figures to die for in the G7?
Line goes up.
Yeah, right, okay. Like it's delivery. Look at the things that we've delivered, and failing to grasp or understand that even in the old politics, you still had to be able to tell a compelling story. There had to be narrative. Like people, if elections were decided entirely rationally, politics would look very different than the way it is now. Increasingly now in our current age, actually delivery counts for even less than it used to, and it's actually probably not even about narrative or story, and it's just about attention and being able to hold conversation and hold people to look at and talk about you, perhaps not even in a positive light, which I think the Republicans understood very, very well. So if you look at Clacton, and the candidate's name escapes me now, but the Labour Party had this very vibrant, like really cool, dapper candidate, right? And a picture pops up on my Instagram, and I see him with Farage, and I'm going, that looks interesting. Yeah. That looks like an electoral contest that could really shape up to be something. And over the course of the election, it transpires that he's had resource withdrawn from him. He was told to campaign in other constituencies. Yeah, right, okay. Now, obviously, elections are like a war, and if you look, and as it transpired, Farage is going to walk it here. Let's not bother. Let's not waste our time. However, I'm also thinking on the other side of it, you potentially have like a star in the making for your party in this seat, and there's an opportunity here for you to start to tell a story. Yeah, okay, maybe he doesn't win, but he can become a vector for your messaging about like the economy, about the type of Britain you want to be, and he can be the person that carries that. And Labour doesn't do it. Yeah. And I wonder how much of that trap they are falling into. Keir Starmer stands up in the House of Commons and says, PwC says this is a great place to invest, and it's like, you are mental if you think that that's a great thing to be saying. I mean, there's some polling which came out just this week, and I think it was More in Common who came out with it, which showed that most people don't believe that growth is going to benefit them. So you've got Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer betting the house on growth, and most people are saying, well, even if you do deliver it, how's it going to benefit me? And again, you can either look at them and go, well, you're stupid because line go up, or you could say, well, actually, we've had years of growth under the Conservatives, which didn't benefit you because we've got this parasitic landlord model of an economy where the only way to make money is to own stuff and just skim profit off the top. And if you have to work for your living, you're locked out of that, right? And so this is the problem with like line go up mentality, is that it doesn't recognize that people are right to feel that growth doesn't benefit them. Because it hasn't. Yeah. I also think, slight tangent, Hunter S. Thompson wrote about when he was trying to like mobilise a national political campaign that he wanted to unite the freak vote and the fuck the bosses vote. And I think Starmer will fall foul of that, like, fuck the bosses, call in sick, like whatever you want to call it. But essentially, because he has the energy of a deputy head. Who's losing control of a school assembly. Like, not even the headmaster. Yeah, exactly. I'm embarrassed for you at this point, Keir. And as a result, he will just, because he thinks the things that like give him authority or are a positive political story to tell, and they're just falling on deaf ears as to carry on, like the children lose attention and start fighting with each other in the classroom, right? I mean, this is also the thing about, I think, proximity to institutions and disdain for institutions, which is Nigel Farage gets it. He walked into the European Parliament and he was like, fuck you all, because I know that's going to go down so well with my base. And the thing about people who are being caught by liberal institutions and kind of want to defend democracy and all this stuff is that they can't then channel this disdain for institutions that people have good reasons to feel let down by. And I think that that's, Keir Starmer's on a particular extreme of that because he loves status and feeling. He loves a lectern. Like, he loves, the pictures on the plane when they're flying to DC. Pictures on the plane. Surrounded by the journalists. He loves that stuff. Yeah. Whereas, Reform as a challenger party know that you have to
at least look like you hate this stuff.
Yeah. We'll stop talking about reform in a second, but I guess I would just ask now, do you think they're underpriced, or do you think they're being taken seriously enough as like a political challenge to Keir Starmer?
Labour think that reform are going to take out the Conservative vote. And that's why they've been so reluctant to take the fight to them. I think that how it plays out with our first past the post electoral system is like...
Yeah, what happens?
Like, don't know how that one's going to play out. But just anecdotally, there are people I know who don't live in London, didn't go to uni, who are saying, I quite like the look of this Nigel Farage guy. And look, they're saying that they might legalise weed. Like, I want to, I'm into that.
Yeah.
Like, they're playing a very clever game in terms of how to appeal to young people who, that half of young people who didn't go to uni. They know very well how to talk to them.
Yeah. We'll sort of getting towards the end. We'll rattle through a few bits and pieces. But you talk about the media, and you talk about how the media has kind of collaborated with the political class to create this culture of distraction, and talking about in the context of how culture war serves a political purpose. I mean, could you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Sure. I mean, maybe just to say what I think culture war is.
Yeah.
Is that I think culture war is a way of looking at politics where whatever kind of conflict you want to look at, you turn it into a story about a group of people who are trying to impose their will on you and change how you think, how you talk and what you do. And so it means that something which has got nothing to do with identity, like the climate, becomes a story of competing identities where it's just stop oil versus ordinary people. And culture war is sort of like, 1,000 doors, which it just opens up to the same space, which is here's this minority and it's trying to tell you what to do. And that minority can be trans people, it can be, BLM, it can be whoever. A particular kind of pundit-driven media, which is, an increasingly dominant model of media, worked out that this plays very well online. And if you can get people riled up online, that brings an audience to you. And when you're in an era of, everyone's consuming more media than ever, that's not actually good if you're establishment media because there's more competition than ever and, ad revenues are falling through the floor. You need things to go viral. And so that's the incentive for calling up someone like me when I'm in my 20s and being like, do you want to debate whether or not Apu's racist? And because I'm like, well, I'm broke and I'm scared that the left isn't going to get a chance to put across this point of view, I'll say yes. And there I am, like an idiot, like thinking that what comes out of my mouth is going to be more important than the visual on the screen of a brown person telling you something's racist.
And you presumably you are wise, or you feel you're smarter when people call you up and ask you to do things like that, or I don't know. Like,
I don't answer the phone anymore.
Really?
I'm like, no,
no, thank you.
But I understand why at that time I didn't feel that way. There weren't very many people on the left in the media. It felt like this moment where politically things could be up for grabs, and I was also young and stupid. I'm still one of those things, but I was still stupid enough to go, oh well, people will listen to what it is I have to say. Like, the story is written for you before you go on.
I mean, I wasn't planning to ask you this, but I will. It's quite personal, but like, you have become like a bit of a figurehead, right, for people of a progressive bent in this country, and that must weigh quite heavily. It's like there must be a sense of responsibility or obligation. Like, clearly there was when you're talking about going on and defending Apu, but like, yeah, I mean, talk to me about how it feels. Like, almost even in the process of writing a book, that that there are people who are going to be looking to what you say here as something that's going to guide their politics for the next 5-10 years, even longer, hopefully.
I mean, on the one hand, it's an immense privilege, right? Like, I get paid to have opinions. Most people do that for free, all right? So,
yeah.
That's a position of immense privilege. I think that people, on the left can look at individuals like me and go, you've got too much power. And you know what? They're right. Like they're completely right. It's a reflection of how politics has become subsumed into media. And people like me, where it's like, to whom am I accountable? Like, what strategy am I carrying out? Well, it's just the one that's like kind of half formed in my own head. So those people are completely right to, I think, look with a certain amount of suspicion at kind of like, you know, pundit political operators. And I think that one of the things that I wish I'd written in the book, and it's so annoying that it only comes into your head when you're like, oh, the manuscript is done. And I'm like, wait a minute, is that we're in a period where the left is in a lot of intense political struggle with very few political organizations. So take trans rights, for instance. How many pro-trans political organizations are there? Not many. You've got charities. Yeah. You've got Stonewall, Mermaids, Transpire. This is the charity model. It's not a political model. You've got role models and figureheads, but, you know, who are the people who are part of, you know, an organizing group with a strategy? That's very different from the civil rights era. And similarly, you know, someone like me popping up and like, you know, articulating the left position, like, and also like, what's that? It's what me and the producer have decided it is. You know, that's not coming from, you know, a political organization. So I think people are right to feel annoyed about that.
Yeah. Do you view your media work, like whether it's Novara, writing books, appearing here or wherever else, as an extension of like as like political praxis, as like a political project? Do you view it as political in that sense?
Oh yeah, I mean, also every journalist does, whether they're aware of it or not.
You're honest about it.
Yeah, at least I'm honest about it. I mean, like, you know, do you think Harry Cole doesn't see himself as a political operator? He might not say that he is, but he definitely fucking is. And I just think that, like, what I want is for the audience to feel like they know where I stand, that they can trust that there's a journalistic process where I've tried to be as fair and as accurate as possible in the handling of facts.
Yeah.
But obviously, I'm a partisan. And I trust the audience with that knowledge. And I just wish that more people would take that view, where they go, here's what I'm about. Here's the journalistic process. I'm not beyond reproach. Feel free to criticize that process. But, like, I'm going to be fair and accurate in my handling of facts, but I'm a partisan. I just wish people would say it.
Yeah, and a bit of transparency. It goes a long way. We don't have time to talk about your exclusive interview with Dominic Cummings, your time with Piers Morgan. There's so much in there. All we can say is we have to get people to buy the book, Minority Rule. All good booksellers, bad booksellers as well.
Yeah, I mean, buy the book. I've got a cat to feed.
Absolutely, feed that cat. Mufasa?
Musa, no.
Musa, sorry.
After Musa Dembele.
Sorry, my bad. Ash, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming in. It's fascinating reading your writing, listening to you speak. We're super grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.